Hi Titans, and welcome to another edition of In Focus, where Titan TV sits down with one of our very own CSUF professors to dive deep into current events. Today we have Dr. Kate Burlingham, Associate Professor in the History Department. We have all watched the devastating news coming in from every media outlet highlighting the destruction from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but many of us are unable to understand why all of this is happening. Dr. Burlingham is here to help us make some sense of all of the different information coming in and to help us better understand why the invasion is taking place. Welcome to the show, Dr. Burlingham. It's so great to have you on In Focus.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. I did want to dive into, some of the current event that we've been experiencing here. What is the relation between the U.S. and Russia and the USSR?
So that's a long story that we don't have time to completely cover while we're here. But, the United States, as it existed when it came together as the United States after the American Revolution, has always had relations with what was then the Russian Empire. And so I think most people are aware of U.S. relations with Russia once it especially became the Soviet Union. I think most people think that that happened after the Second World War in 1945, but the Soviet Union becomes the Soviet Union in 1922. And in fact, Woodrow Wilson, who was president of the United States at the time, sends troops to support sort of like a counter-revolution in Siberia. So we have a long, sordid history with what would become the USSR. And I would say that after that point, relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union are adversarial. In the midst of the Second World War, because you make relations with people sometimes in the Second World, in the midst of war to expedite or in order to have alliances, we do have alliances with the Soviet Union. Those come in and out. The head of the Soviet Union at that time was Joseph Stalin. We align with him in order to fight Hitler in Europe. I think that sometimes for people it's a little bit confusing because were we friendly with them? Well, we were aligned with them during the Second World War. So then how do we get into the Cold War? And so following the Second World War, or in the midst of the Second World War, really, these relationships start to break down, but we need the Soviet Union to stop, to come in from the eastern side of Europe to fight Hitler and the Nazis and the other fascists. So relations between the United States and Russia start to break down, but it's really after, sort of towards the end of the Second World War and then after that we see the beginning of what we would know formally as the beginning of the Cold War. But as I said, those relations start much earlier. But the thing to keep in mind is that, that's an adversarial relationship for the duration of the Cold War. We are two competing empires. I think historians like to really think about the United States as an empire, as looking for influence in the world. In terms of the post-Cold War relations between the U.S. and Russia, I would venture to say that they're not, Russia's always been adversarial-esque, if that's a word. Some of this is related to the creation of an organization called NATO, which is a North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And it is meant to be sort of a stopgap against Russian attacks, Soviet attacks. And there's and this is, again, relevant to what's happening today. When you join NATO, you have a collective security agreement. It's called Article 5. And this is basically the idea that if one of us is attacked, all of us are attacked, and therefore all of us will respond. And so when the Cold War ends, Russia, prior to the end of the Cold War, Russia had created its sort of answer to NATO, which was called the Warsaw Pact. And when the Cold War ends, Russia dissolves the Warsaw Pact, but NATO isn't dissolved. Now, the main focus of NATO, it's not an economic alliance, it's a military alliance. And its purpose was to protect against Soviet attack. So the Russians are constantly bringing this up, saying, why does NATO still exist? If the purpose of it was to protect against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, why is there still a NATO alliance? And so I bring this up to say that although the Cold War was over, and we did have relations with Russia and with the leaders there, it's not a super friendly relationship. We do coordinate on things. We sign treaties to try and denuclearize together and globally, and we do sign trade agreements. But there is this lingering question of NATO and Europe, eventually the creation of the EU, the European Union, which happens in the 90s, and the feeling by the Russians that they are surrounded. You know, Russia wanting to make sure that NATO didn't get on the doorstep of Russia, and sort of loose promises, especially during the Clinton administration, about how close they were willing to push NATO to the doorstep of Russia. This is a very long answer, and I apologize for it, but it's a really complicated. The takeaway from that is that our relationships with Russia go back, hundreds of years, and they're very complicated. And that plays into what is unfolding in Ukraine right now.
That is a lot of information. I'm so glad that you were able to elaborate so much on this, because many don't really know what's going on exactly.
Yeah.
And like you said, it goes back many years. So I did want to ask, why is Ukraine so important to Russia?
So Ukraine. Okay, where do we begin? We have our globe here, but it's very small. But Ukraine is located just south of Russia, of what the West considers to be the landmass of Russia. But it has a long history with Ukraine, and there are people who are ethnically identify as being Russian or Slavic and who speak Russian. But Ukraine, like many of these border regions, they're the formerly part of the Soviet Union, but also formerly part of the Soviet Empire, have Slavic people and Russian-speaking people, and people who are Russian Orthodox, for example. It also has to do with religion. But they see themselves as wanting to have their own governments separate from Russia. And that has resulted in many of these places having very brutal, ugly wars with Russia in order to break away. And Ukraine in particular, for Russia, has a particular hold on it. And so there's a disagreement by some people who say that Ukraine is part of Russia, and other people say, no, Ukraine is its own place. It's Ukrainian. And that's also, again, a very long history of a back and forth of if Ukraine is its own place or if it belongs to Russia. And that's somewhat of what's being capitalized on here. I think there's another aspect to this, which is a more modern aspect, which has to do with the Black Sea ports in Ukraine, that Ukraine borders the Black Sea, and that has to do with oil and gas and other sorts of things that have more to do with geopolitics today. But there is a long history of this battle between Ukrainians and Russians. So what's happening today has a very big prehistory to it.
I see. And I totally have, I've read so much about it as well, and I'm so glad that you were able to mention earlier as well with, NATO, and because it's just been overwhelming, a lot of information, a lot of history for sure. Mm-hmm. But I also was just very curious, if this were to continue on even further and say that the Russian war were to spill over to other neighboring countries, what would that potentially mean?
It would be bad. So surrounding Ukraine are NATO countries, most notably Poland. So according to Article 5, if a NATO country is invaded, then all of NATO responds. And so there is a lot of people trying very hard to make sure that we do not tiptoe or trip into World War III, because no one wants that. But that's what people are trying very hard to avoid. And what is scary is that some of this is about perception. So, okay, yes, if Russia were to invade Poland, that would be obvious, right? But if a Polish or even American or another NATO ally's airplanes fly into Ukrainian airspace and is shot down, that's also a declaration of war. I had heard some reports of intelligence that was leaving the United States government to help Ukrainian soldiers, but Vladimir Putin has stated that if intelligence is seen as being actionable, that they would interpret that as NATO involvement in the war and they would consider it an act of war. So there's a whole group of lawyers that are poring over all of the intel to make sure that whatever they're giving to the Ukrainians to help them fight would not be perceived to be them getting involved. And for me personally, that's a really gray area, because you're dealing with perception. It's not about, of shooting down a plane or invading. And so this gets to why there's been calls for, Ukrainians have asked for NATO to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine to stop Russian jets. But that would count as becoming involved in the eyes of NATO, and in the eyes of the United States. That would count as becoming involved in the war. And again, that becomes a declaration of war against the Russians. So I think on the west side, they're trying very hard not to trip into war.
And now, would you say that this would be potentially the start of World War III? Should we be worried? I know a lot of us are scared right now.
I hope not. I mean, it feels, I think for people who study this region or who study U.S. foreign relations or who study history, there are a lot of echoes of the beginnings of the First World War and the Second World War that feel scary. I never say that history repeats itself, because it doesn't. Every situation is unique. But I think everyone who's in a position to do anything right now realizes the potential consequences. I will say that in the start of the Second World War, there was no NATO. There was no collective security in the same way, so that when Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia, and everyone said, just let him take Czechoslovakia, in today, an invasion of a NATO country counts as an invasion of all the countries. So collective security has changed. And I guess what we're going to find is collective security is going to work. But I think it's scary. I mean, I think in the United States, we are shielded by our landmass. And that was the case in the First World War, and it was the case in the Second World War until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. It is easy here to forget what else is going on in the world. And I was texting with a friend of mine who's in Brussels, who works for the EU, and it's palpable there, right? It's palpable in Europe that you have an armed nuclear power on the border of Europe, with a person who might use those nukes, and that I think it was yesterday, Russia bombed a facility that was housing international fighters, but also things coming over the border from Poland, like support for Ukrainian soldiers. And that was bombed, but it was like 30 miles from the border with Poland, so real close. So I don't know, but I think it's serious and it's scary.
It is very scary. And my next question would have to be, why has Putin decided to invade now?
That's a really good question. And a lot of people are trying to figure that out. I would say, I think we all have to find the people that we trust and whose voices we think are informed. And so the people that I have been reading, who I think know more about some of this stuff than I do, they talk about it in different ways. On the one hand, they talk about how Putin he takes the long view of things. So something that I should talk about and back up and say is that in 2014, Putin took over Crimea. Now, Crimea is wish I had a map, but is a little piece of Ukraine that sticks out into the Black Sea. And it has a long checkered history of going back and forth between Russian, Soviet powers and Ukraine. And he took over Crimea in 2014, and the world community kind of lashed out at him. He was kicked out of the G8. But nobody really did anything, not in the same level of what's happening today. So that might have convinced him that he had the ability to sort of go further in. The other part of this, though, in bringing up 2014 is that, and thinking about Putin and his long game, is that this is a war I think we can't think of starting when he invaded Ukraine a few weeks ago. This is a longer story, and Putin sees that as a longer story. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who say that this war started when the Cold War ended, and that Putin was part of many people. Putin was originally in the the KGB, which is the Secret Service of the Soviet government. And he would then lead what's called the FSB, which is what became of the KGB. And he's surrounded by people who really did think that the end of the Soviet Union was a bad thing and that were determined to do something about it. So when Putin took over Crimea, he gave a speech referencing all of the czars of Russia and how this was part of the legacy of that, and the legacy of the West always trying to undermine Russia, Slavs. And so that he sees his battle as part of this much hundreds-year-old long story about Russia being undermined, and that this is the next chapter. In terms of why now in Ukraine, because Ukraine's been at war in many ways, since the 2000s. And Crimea was seized. There's an area that borders, that's in Ukraine called the Donbass region, which has had a lot of fighting in there. This is an area that Putin has since declared separate from Ukraine, and that's where a lot of the fighting is coming in from now. But, I think some of this has to do with politics also. And Europe, in terms of the long scope of European history, he perceives Europe to be weak right now in terms of leadership. It is said that the only person he respected in European government was Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor, and she's no longer there. There's a government that is made up of multiple parties. It's seen as being divided. We don't like to see the United States as being weak, but the United States is weak politically now because we are divided amongst ourselves. And so we don't have the same kind of strength that we had at other times. And so there's something to be said for this being a moment that he seized. And so there's symbolism there in terms of it being the 100-year anniversary. So I think a lot of factors come together. It's also a lot about, it's kind of reading tea leaves to try and figure out why Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing now. And there's a lot of people being paid a lot of money to try and figure that out. But it seems to me that we cannot dismiss Putin as being crazy. He is calculated. He has a view of the West, which is pretty negative. He has a view of America as being an imperial power that is trying to take away the power of the Russians, and he sees himself as the next czar of Russia. And in fact, I heard an interview this morning with a woman who I admire, and she was talking about being in a room. She was a diplomat for the United States. So there's a room where Putin met with all of the diplomats, and in the room there are 4 statues, and they're all of former czars. And then there's Vladimir, the Tsar Vladimir. So the symbolism to bring in people, that's what they're being presented, I think speaks a lot of the thinking that's behind him going on.
I see. My goodness. But I honestly have had a lot of thought about this too. And I might want to just bring it up here because I know you mentioned politics. Yeah. But as far as, I want to say 2016 and 2020, the elections that we've had, how were there associations there with what's been going on now, with Russia's involvement?
So again, I'm cribbing this from other people, but I think that it holds true, which is that one of the ways that this might feel like World War III, but it's not World War III in the same way. The technology is different, right? So war can be waged in different kinds of ways, and in terms of the internet. And Russia is engaging in that warfare. And many people believe that was just a continuation of the war. So the invasion of Ukraine now is like the 19th century version of it, where you just like roll in with your tanks and you take a country and mow it down. But the 21st century version of it is the misinformation campaigns, which is still going on right now in terms of what's going on with Russia. There's all kinds of misinformation, and you really do, it's so good that it is very easy for even the best people to fall for it. So it's not even being a good consumer, you have to be an excellent consumer of information. And Russian involvement and in trying to sway public opinion in our country in both of those elections was documented and, I would say, successful, because the division that exists in our country right now was there. It was merely stoked. But, none of the stuff that's bubbling to the surface now is new. Mm-hmm. These are divisions that have framed our country for many years in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, class. But it took a stoking of that fire to really convince Americans that they can't even relate to the person next to them, to their neighbor, just because they voted for another person, right? And the sowing of a political class that espouses those kinds of views has really weakened the ability of the United States to act as a whole. And I think there's a real fear of what the next presidential election is going to be like. What it's going to mean for our own democracy, because the goal of Vladimir Putin is to undermine Western democracy. And what American democracy has been undermined. And so this is all part of one story, right? Because if we can't if we can't respond in unison, then he can do whatever the heck he wants. Mm-hmm. And I think he has, I don't know, I can't put words in Vladimir Putin's mouth, but the response that's happened in Ukraine, it seems what everyone is saying, was unexpected. The Ukrainians responded as strongly as they did, and that the European Union was able to get everyone on board in to have one answer to Russia in such a unified way. And I don't think anyone thought that was possible. So that might be messing with the script.
Was there anything you would like to let our viewers know regarding what's going on in Ukraine?
I mean, I think everyone needs to stay alert. They need to watch it. And pay attention and learn. And also, you know, we learned this after the last election and in 2016 and again in 2020 about being good consumers of information, but they need to know that there is a war going on the internet. It's particularly bad, I've heard, on Reddit, but it's on Twitter, it's everywhere. And you need to find the people you trust who know how to look at things. So when there's a line of tanks rolling down, they can look at it and say, that's footage from 3 years ago, this is fake. I can't know that. A tank is a tank is a tank to me, right? Like, I don't know. But I know people who I follow in these areas who can make those predictions. So I think, you know, staying vigilant, staying focused, and, you know, alert and being good consumers of information at this point, I think, is like the most that we can do. I mean, of course, people can give money to organizations that are working with refugees, but, you know, on a personal level, I think people just need to become really keyed into what it is and always ask questions. If something doesn't look right to you, if it doesn't sit well with you, if there's an inkling in your head that something's not right, trust that, because that's what it's going to take.
Perfect. Thank you so much again for meeting with me. That was all the questions I had today, and I really appreciate all the information that you were able to give us.
Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, Titans, thank you so much for sitting in on this thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Burlingham. As major consumers of online news, it's very easy to be misinformed. So we want to thank Dr. Burlingham for sharing her insight on what we can collectively do to help this situation. Until next time, I'm Vanessa Castaneda, and this is In Focus.